Hello there, and welcome back to the Action Window with me, Action Johnny. In part 1 of this series, we looked at everything that made the Darktide beta so special and what's got me all hot and bothered under the collar. But now it's time to look at a few things that weren't so hot and definitely need addressing before the game hits full release. Before we begin, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel so I can climb out of this abyss of new content creator obscurity and up further towards the lofty heights of that 250 subscriber goal. With that out of the way, let's get into it. We're going to start this off with an absolute Fatshark classic. Absolutely nothing named in any of the game's descriptions is explained at all. So what do I mean by this? Well, take a look at these weapon properties here I've got up on the screen. What is mobility? What is stopping power? How do I use these bars to better understand my weapon and make informed choices on what properties I want to prioritize? What's a maniac? What enemies fall under the unarmored categories? Is it just regular poxwalkers? Specials like the dog? Both? Even ignoring the total lack of terminology definitions, it's not even clear if the more obviously named of these bars work the way you'd assume they would. For example, the entire time I was playing the beta, I assumed the damage property would be the one that most impacted my weapon's, well, damage. But after the beta had ended and I spent some time milling about the Darktide Reddit and Discord servers, I actually spoke to a few people that spent their closed beta time testing this stuff out, and I was told that they actually found stopping power affected damage more than the damage stat. Like, what? How the hell does that work, Fatshark? Now, look, I do get that choosing not to give your players all the information, such as exact numerical data, is a relevant design philosophy, rooted in the intention of driving your player base to discover these things for themselves. I also understand that giving exact numerical data for everything promotes a hyper-focused min-maxing style meta, and takes some of the joy out of co-op games like this, where the fun of the game is repeating the same gameplay loop with different variables, like choosing a different weapon each time. But not having any kind of terminology definition in a modern style game is, in my opinion, a hell trespass-worthy sin. The greatest joy of being a video game player is getting to make choices, and in order to make certain choices, we need to be able to understand what the terminology used in the game actually pertains to. Otherwise, we're just floundering around in the dark like some sort of sad, sightless, deep ocean fish. I've got absolutely no idea why this wasn't implemented in the game from day one. This has been a repeated issue with Fatshark games since the first Vermintide, with players continuously feeding back to the devs on how they want something, anything to go off. And I've got to say, I found it a bit disheartening that those voices were once again seemingly ignored. Maybe this will be corrected at launch, but based on Fatshark's history, I'm not too hopeful here. Continuing on from the game's bizarre inability to define anything at all, the HUD, or heads-up display, for those unfamiliar with the terminology, felt sorely lacking to me. Now, this is an area of the game where I do expect numerical data to be present. For example, the remaining toughness and HP of my teammate, the ammo levels of my teammates, who has grenades, who's in coherency, who isn't, what buffs are actively applying to me, what those buffs do, and so on and so forth. This isn't rocket science, Fatshark. This is basic information that really should just be available to the player, and it's frustrating that it isn't. Also, the HUD was pretty ugly. Minor gripe, I know, but I'm not alone in thinking this. It would be nice to have some level of customization here, where players have the option to move where certain aspects of the HUD are on their screen, rather than being locked into this whole one-size-fits-all affair. Moving on to the stability and performance of the game, this is probably where my biggest concerns with the beta lay, and before we get into this, yes, I know it's a beta, and yes, I'm taking that into consideration, but I'll just come out and say it. The game crashed a lot. And I'm not talking server crashes or disconnects here. I'm talking full-on game crashes to desktop, or worse, game crashes that blue screen my PC to oblivion. On the first day of the beta, I was also getting crashes that caused a corruption of the game files, which meant that I then had to verify the integrity of the game files through Steam before being able to play again. That particular crash issue did seem to disappear on day 2, so not really sure what was happening there, but it was reminiscent of an issue that happened with Vermintide 2 a lot, and to see that rear its ugly head day 1 of closed beta did not instill me with confidence. Now, sometimes I would get 3 to 4 hours of uninterrupted gaming, and when that was the case, obviously everything was all rosebuds and sunshine, but considering this closed beta build was an earlier build of the game, it does leave me a little bit concerned in regards to how they are going to fix and address the various crash issues 6 weeks before launch. because to be honest, it seems doubtful that they'll be able to in that time frame. So yeah, I'm not exactly expecting the smoothest product on launch. Hopefully all the feedback and crash reports from the closed beta will go some of the way towards ironing out some of these creases, but I can still see the game being released in a state where crashes, for whatever reason, will be a more common occurrence than one would desire from a finished game. If that's the case, it's not the end of the world. The game definitely isn't in the unplayable, shambolic state that some other big titles of the previous year were. Yes, I'm looking at you, Battlefield 2042. But it would be remiss of me not to mention the crashes because, as I said, they happen very frequently for me. In that same vein, the graphic optimization was really pretty bad. I was playing the game on an RTX 3080 GPU, a Ryzen 7 5800X CPU, and 32GB of RAM, and I went into the beta expecting to be able to turn on all the bells and whistles and max out my settings no problem. Well, that apparently was not to be, because as it transpired, this version of the game was not at all well optimized. If I attempted to play with ray tracing enabled on even the lowest setting, my game performance dropped significantly, easily by 30 or 40 frames per second. Even on high settings with ray tracing turned off, the game would sometimes drop below 60 FPS when there was a lot of stuff going on the screen, and considering that Fatshark advertised that they partnered with Nvidia for the development of this game, I was surprised and disappointed to see just how poorly optimized it seemed to be for my system running none other than an Nvidia GPU. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt here because this was a closed beta on an older build, yada 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 and the rest of it, but honestly this should be one of their highest priorities to fix for launch. Another criticism I'd like to touch on would be that certain player actions and design choices inherent in the game felt clunky and unresponsive. The tag mechanic was the biggest offender here, and in some cases didn't even work. Bomber enemies, for example, were seemingly immune to the tag feature, meaning they could run around with reckless abandon, fragging your entire party into fiery destruction, all the while avoiding detection. Even on enemies where the tagging feature worked, it still felt awkward. If your crosshair wasn't perfectly lined up on them when you tagged them, then it just wouldn't go through. Not great when you're playing a co-op shooter and you need to alert your team to the dangerous enemies that are totally wrecking you. Another big gripe I had was being locked into reload animations. Holy hell, this was so annoying, and I really disliked that this was in the game. It didn't seem to consistently happen. Sometimes I could quick swap out of it, but a lot of the time I couldn't, and those instances could lead to an undesirable, painful death. The Ogren's shotgun deserves a mention for being the weapon which caused the most misery in this regard. Being a single shot break action gun, if I got unlucky, I'd be locked into what felt like an eternity of reload animation.
The reload on this shotgun is painful at
It's
times.
so agonizing, isn't it?
You're like, oh, please put the bullet in the gun.
Now, when we're talking about close-range, melee-centric characters that need to be able to fluidly swap between weapons, this kind of sluggishness is an absolute death sentence. I'm not sure if it was a bug or this was working as intended because, as I said, the consistency of it happening seemed to come and go, but just please, for the love of God, fix it or take it out of the game. Similarly, not being able to reload while sprinting felt like a baffling design choice to me. This is a feature that's pretty common in most modern shooters, and removing that option from the player in a game that really emphasizes good movement and positioning just felt weird. Not sure what the imperative on this one was when the developers sat down and made this decision, but I don't really see what it's adding to the game, and in my opinion, it's well worth changing. Moving on to stuff that wasn't necessarily broken or bad, but could definitely do with a little bit of a polish or a touch-up. I've got a couple of concerns about weapon redundancy and power scaling that I really hope are unfounded, because otherwise the meta for this game is going to feel a lot more limited than the advertised 70+ weapon statistic would suggest. I'm all about having as much meaningful choice in these sorts of games as possible. What I mean by weapon redundancy is having too many weapon archetypes that don't feel different enough from each other to really warrant their existence, or on the other hand, having weapons that are just that much better or that much worse than everything else, and thus end up being auto takes or eternally consigned to the bin of irrelevancy. The most egregious example of this that really sticks out in my mind was unfortunately the chainsword. I know, tragic. This weapon just felt really underwhelming. It didn't have the horde clear abilities of weapons like the Katachan knife or the combat shovel, and its special attack, the iconic chainsword power rev execution of blood and viscera just felt awkward and in a lot of cases dangerous to use. In order to get this execution style special to work, you first had to rev the chainsword using your special attack, an annoyingly long and unnecessary feeling animation. Then you had to connect an attack which caused the chainsword to bite and stick to the affected enemy, leaving you totally exposed and at the mercy of any enemy not getting sword. To add insult to injury, the actual staggering power and damage from this special attack felt severely lacking. It would take sometimes 3 to 4 rev hits to kill a Carapace Armored Mauler on the 3rd difficulty level, and sometimes the attack wouldn't even interrupt the Mauler's active animation. All of this left the weapon feeling like it didn't really have a place in the game, which is absurd for a 40k title. Why on earth would you take this on the Zealot when you could take a super fast, efficient horde clearing weapon or something that just smooshes elites like the Thunderhammer? It really saddened me to discover this, as the chainsword is an iconic weapon in the setting, and it pained me to see it done so dirty like this. I'm not going to go into how I think Fatshark could tweak or balance this weapon. That's a discussion for greater minds than mine, but make no mistake, this weapon was all style and zero substance, and it felt indicative of something that actually could be a bigger issue across multiple weapons in the release version of the game. Another thing that was curiously absent from the beta was the Scoreboard, a feature from Vermintide 2 that allowed players to see some fun statistics at the end of each run. Values such as amounts of various enemies killed, damage done, melee and range kills, damage taken, all those kinds of statistics that your average player likes to see at the end of a match. I wasn't particularly a fan of how this information was presented in Vermintide 2, as the whole green circle thing to highlight which player had achieved the most out of any individual category was, in my opinion, counterproductive to a co-op game. But I'm certainly in favor of each player getting an individual scoreboard at the end of the run because, well, you know, that's just a bit more fun, isn't it? I know they've cited player toxicity as the reason for the scoreboard's omission from Darktide, and I do understand where they're coming from, but I think the devs will have missed a beat if they decide to have zero scoreboard of any kind. It's something players generally enjoy, and it doesn't seem like a big ask to include it in some form. Finally, one last small thing that I think needs tweaking for the final release would be making certain sound cues more noticeable. Certain kinds of special enemies really can just sneak up on you with absolutely no indicator that they've spawned. The Trapper was definitely one sneaky boy in a lot of the games I played, which led to wipes because no one could hear his arrival. Same deal with players going down. It should really be made obvious to the whole team when a teammate, falls on their ass. There'd be instances in a game where I'd be so focused on what I was doing that I'd fail to notice my teammate going down because there just wasn't an obvious audio cue. It wouldn't be until I looked down at the bottom left corner of my HUD and see the red downed bar that I'd realize they were slowly dying, and in a lot of instances that would prove fatal to them as the team would be too slow on the uptake to rescue the situation. Alright guys, that's going to be it for this video and closed beta impression series. I hope you've all enjoyed my TED Talk. Even if it seems like I've just been dumping all over this game in this video, don't walk away with the impression that I didn't like it or I wasn't impressed. I really was. I absolutely adored my time with Darktide over the closed beta weekend. It massaged my dopamine receptors in so many enjoyable ways that now that it's gone, I find myself pining for it. Generally speaking, there was a lot more positive than negative for me, and I can say with complete conviction that I will be pre-ordering this bad boy, even if the initial launch is a little bit rocky. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.